On the frozen, desolate landscapes of the Eastern Front, millions of soldiers were locked in a brutal war of attrition, slowly wasting away from hunger and cold. Their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, their rations meager. But back home, across occupied Europe, a different kind of war was being fought. This one wasn't waged with tanks, but in cellars, in hollowed-out walls, and in secret compartments beneath floorboards. It was a war for survival, and the weapon of choice was food. This system had a name: the Hunger Plan. It was a monstrously simple strategy developed by high-ranking Nazi officials with a clear objective: seize food from conquered territories of the Soviet Union to feed the German army and population. It was a policy of intentional, man-made famine designed to depopulate entire regions deemed racially inferior and make way for German settlement. This plan, primarily directed at the Soviet Union and other parts of Eastern Europe, created a continent-wide network of confiscation and rationing that turned every kitchen into a potential battleground. The decision of what to eat, what to hide, and what to surrender became a matter of life and death. So, what were these precious foods that families risked everything to conceal? The answers reveal a secret history of resilience, ingenuity, and the desperate struggle for survival that has remained hidden in the shadows of the Second World War. Number 1. Potatoes. The first hidden treasure on our list wasn't gold or jewels, but something far more valuable in the math of survival: the potato. To us, it's a simple staple, a common side dish. But in World War II Europe, the potato was king. It was a dense package of calories that could mean the difference between enduring the winter and succumbing to it. Across Europe, the potato was a cornerstone of the wartime diet. Its versatility was its power. It could be boiled, fried, mashed, or grated into flour for bread. For families facing malnutrition, a small garden plot of potatoes offered a small measure of control in a world spiraling into chaos. These secret gardens became arsenals of sustenance. Of course, the occupying forces knew the potato's value. German quartermasters understood that controlling the potato supply was key to controlling the population and feeding their war machine. Requisition orders were common, forcing farmers to surrender huge portions of their harvest. In Germany, while the Nazi regime initially tried to keep its own population well-fed, the strain on supplies was becoming clear. By 1942, there were growing complaints about regional and seasonal potato shortages in major cities, even if a total nationwide failure was avoided. And that's where the hiding began. The methods were born of desperation. Potatoes were buried in garden pits, then camouflaged. They were stored behind false walls in cellars. In rural France, they were hidden at the bottom of haystacks. The risks were enormous. Being caught hoarding was an act of sabotage against the state. Punishments ranged from confiscation and fines to imprisonment, and in the brutally administered territories of the East, it could mean a death sentence. Yet, people took the risk. A family with a hidden stash of potatoes had secured more than just a few meals. They had a buffer against meager state rations and something to trade on the black market, where a few kilos of potatoes could be swapped for soap or medicine. Hiding potatoes wasn't just about staving off hunger. It was about holding onto a sliver of agency in a world that was trying to strip it away. Number 2, turnips and carrots. If the potato was king of the hidden larder, then turnips and carrots were its hardy, essential foot soldiers. They were the unsung heroes of the wartime kitchen, often despised, but absolutely necessary for survival. In an era where fresh vegetables were a memory, and meat was a phantom luxury, these tough roots provided bulk and vital nutrients. Across occupied Europe, the turnip became a grim symbol of hardship. In Germany, the memory of the turnip winter of World War I haunted the populace. A history the Nazi regime was desperate not to repeat. Yet, as the war dragged on, history began to rhyme. So-called ersatz, meatballs, were fashioned from a mixture of potatoes, lentils, and the ever-present turnip. These weren't culinary creations. They were engineering feats designed to trick the stomach into feeling full. Carrots, rich in sugar, served a dual purpose. They were a source of vitamins, a defense against diseases like scurvy, but they also became a secret weapon for the wartime baker. With sugar rations cut to the bone, grated carrots were a common substitute sweetener in cakes, lending moisture and a hint of sweetness to what would have been dry bricks of ration flour. Like potatoes, these vegetables were targeted for confiscation, but their hardiness also made them easier to conceal. They could be stored for months in cool cellars, buried in sand to keep them fresh. Families would dig deep caches in their gardens, lining them with straw before packing them with carrots and turnips, invisible to prying eyes. This act of hiding was especially crucial in the Jewish ghettos, established by the Nazis in occupied Poland and the Soviet Union. There, starvation was a deliberate tool of extermination, with official rations sometimes as low as a few hundred calories a day. For those trapped inside, a smuggled turnip or a handful of carrots was a tiny victory against a system designed to eradicate them. Hiding a simple root vegetable was an act of profound defiance, a declaration that they would not quietly starve. Number 3, lentils. In the grand theater of war, a silent, desperate battle was being waged on a microscopic level: the war for protein. With meat rations dwindling to almost nothing for most civilians, the body's need for this building block of life became an obsession. The answer for many, hidden away in sacks and jars, was the humble lentil. Lentils, beans, and peas were the protein of the poor, the meat of the masses. They were a nutritional powerhouse in a tiny, durable form. For families in urban Germany or occupied France, they were a godsend. Their long shelf life made them ideal for hoarding. A single sack of lentils bought on the black market could be the foundation for dozens of meals over many months. The official rations often felt like a cruel joke. In France, the daily caloric intake from official rations fluctuated, sometimes hovering around 100 to 200 calories, a level of slow starvation, though many supplemented this with gardens or black market finds. The meat ration, when you could get it, was just a few dozen grams a week. Lentils filled this nutritional void. They were the main ingredient in the common wartime stews and thick soups, often called Eintopf or one-pot meals in Germany. A handful of lentils, boiled with a potato and a turnip, could create a meal that was filling and, most importantly, provided enough protein to keep a body going. Hiding lentils was less about elaborate concealment and more about careful acquisition. The challenge wasn't just storing them, but getting them in the first place. The thriving black market, or marché noir in France, was the primary source. Prices were astronomical. A family might trade an heirloom or a piece of clothing for a bag of lentils. The transaction itself was dangerous, as both buyer and seller were criminals in the eyes of the state, risking fines or prison if caught. Once home, the lentils were guarded like treasure. They were stored in small containers and hidden in multiple locations, under floorboards, in the back of wardrobes, in attics. This was a form of insurance. If one stash was found, others might survive. It was the knowledge that, for another week or month, the family wouldn't just be filling their stomachs with watery soup, but ingesting the very protein needed to keep them alive. Number 4, the staff of life: bread and flour. There is perhaps no food more fundamental to European civilization than bread. It's the staff of life, and in times of scarcity, the ultimate measure of survival. During World War II, the fight to get a daily loaf, or the flour to make it became a central drama of civilian life. Under occupation, bread changed. Fine white flour vanished, replaced by gritty, dark flours extended with anything that could add bulk: rye, barley, potato flour, and ground chestnuts. The resulting loaves were dense and sour, but they were calories. During the brutal siege of Leningrad, the bread ration for civilians plunged to a horrifying 125 grams a day. This small, dense slice was often adulterated with fillers like oil cake, bran, and cellulose from wood pulp to stretch the flour. A survivor recalled that bread in those days was like gold. Given this reality, controlling wheat and flour was a primary goal for occupying forces. In France, German authorities confiscated huge quantities of grain to be shipped to Germany, driving the real trade underground. This is where elaborate hiding methods came into play. Flour is tricky to hide, so secret compartments were built into barn walls, their locations known only to the head of the household. Some farmers buried sealed metal containers of grain in their fields, memorizing the location like a treasure map. For city dwellers, getting flour often meant hamster trips, dangerous bicycle or train rides into the countryside to trade goods for a few kilograms of flour, which then had to be smuggled past checkpoints. For those who couldn't get flour, hiding the bread itself was the only choice. A family wouldn't eat their meager ration all at once. Portions would be carefully wrapped and hidden, saved for the children or for a day when the bakeries had nothing. In the ghettos of Eastern Europe, smuggling a single loaf of bread from the Aryan side was an act of incredible bravery, often done by children who could slip through gaps in the walls. Hiding bread and flour was a fight for the most basic form of sustenance, a rejection of the state's power to decide who ate and who starved. Number 5. Dairy. In the gray, nutrient-starved world of occupied Europe, fat was like gold, and the most coveted sources were dairy products: milk, butter, and cheese. These items, once common, were transformed by war into rare, almost mythical luxuries. They represented a richness and energy that rationed diets desperately lacked. The Nazi occupation machine ran on plunder. In countries like France and the Netherlands, authorities seized control of creameries, diverting the lion's share of dairy to feed the German army and home front. For locals, this meant butter vanished from shops, and fresh milk was reserved for infants and pregnant women, and even then in tiny amounts. Aged cheeses became treasures traded on the black market. The ideology of deprivation was clear in Nazi policy and practice, which prioritized fats and other key foods for the German population, while deliberately giving starvation-level rations to Jews, Soviet POWs, and other camp inmates. This trickled down to the general rationing system, where the fat ration was often just a few grams of margarine a day. This lack of dietary fat led to constant hunger and an inability to stay warm. This desperate need drove the hiding of dairy. For a farm family with a cow, the animal itself was a secret to be protected. Its milk was liquid gold. A portion was surrendered, but the rest was quietly diverted. This raw milk provided essential fats for children, and any surplus could be churned into butter or made into simple cheese. Hiding these products was a challenge. Butter was packed into earthenware crocks, sealed, and then buried in a cool cellar or submerged in a well. A large wheel of cheese was a significant asset. In France, cheese producers kept 2 sets of books, one for the Germans and one for the black market. Mayep Guise, who helped hide Anne Frank's family, spoke of the immense risk involved in sourcing these items, visiting multiple shops to buy small amounts to avoid suspicion. For an urban family, a block of real butter was a sign of immense privilege or profound risk. It wasn't used for casual cooking. It was medicine. A smear of butter on a child's ration bread was a strategic deployment of life-sustaining fat. Number 6, nettles and dandelions. As the war machine stripped the land of its cultivated produce, people across Europe were forced to turn back the clock. They rediscovered ancient knowledge, looking not to empty shops, but to forests, meadows, and even the cracks in the pavement. Here they found a secret, free, and sometimes dangerous source of sustenance: the wild harvest. In both the starving cities of the Soviet Union and the tightly rationed centers of Germany, the official diet was a monotonous parade of starch. This led to a rampant increase in deficiency, diseases like scurvy. The antidote often grew freely all around them. Stinging nettles, a plant most people avoid, became a springtime delicacy. Once boiled, the sting is neutralized, and the leaves provide a nutritious, spinach-like green, rich in vitamins. Dandelions were also entirely edible. The leaves were used in salads, and the roots could be roasted as a coffee substitute. During the siege of Leningrad, where starvation was absolute, citizens ate pigweed and boiled leather belts to survive. In that context, a patch of dandelions was a treasure. Soviet families also boiled rose hips and even pine needles to make a bitter tea that was rich in vitamin C, a crucial defense against malnutrition. While these plants grew wild, harvesting them had its own risks. It wasn't that the act of foraging itself was seen as dissent, but venturing into forests or fields could mean running into military patrols or restricted zones. There was also the danger of misidentification. With hunger clouding judgment, people sometimes made fatal mistakes, consuming poisonous plants. Despite the risks, the wild harvest was an essential part of the hidden food economy. It was free, accessible to those with no money for the black market. The act of foraging was itself an act of resilience. It required knowledge and patience. Hiding this food was simple. It was consumed almost as soon as it was gathered. The true secret wasn't in the cellar, but in the mind. The knowledge of which weed was food, which leaf was medicine, and which root could help you survive another spring. Number 7, sugar beets. In a world drained of sweetness, families turned to a coarse, humble root for a taste of the forbidden, the sugar beet. This wasn't sweet sugar cane, but its tough, earthy cousin, grown mainly for industrial processing. For the wartime civilian, however, it became a surprisingly versatile key to survival. The Nazi war economy was built on self-sufficiency. Imports like cane sugar were heavily restricted, and the sugar beet was a pillar of this strategy. But as the war progressed, the beet itself became a target for both official requisition and clandestine use. For a family that could get their hands on a few sugar beets, it was a multi-purpose lifeline. The most obvious use was to try and make sugar at home. This was a difficult process of boiling and reducing the beets to create a dark, molasses-like syrup. This beet syrup had a strong, earthy flavor, but it was sweet. It could sweeten bitter acorn coffee or be spread on ration bread for a much-needed burst of energy. But the beet's utility didn't end there. The root itself could be boiled or roasted as a tough, woody vegetable. More commonly, it was grated into stews to add bulk. Even the leafy tops, normally used for animal fodder, were harvested. In German cities, women boiled these leaves as a gritty substitute for spinach or cabbage. Hiding sugar beets followed the same logic as potatoes. They were buried in cellars or garden pits. The risk of being caught was significant. A farmer diverting his harvest was stealing directly from the state's industrial supply and would be punished. But the temptation was overwhelming, as the black market paid handsomely for anything that could provide sweetness. The reliance on the sugar beet shows how the very definition of food was stretched to its absolute limits, and how people used immense ingenuity to carve out a small measure of comfort from the soil of their occupied homeland. Number 8, preserved foods. In the uncertain world of World War II, the only certainty was the changing of the seasons. Summer's relative bounty would inevitably give way to the hunger winter. To survive, families had to become masters of time, capturing the harvest in jars and crocks. Preserved foods, jams, pickles, and salted meats became edible time capsules, a hidden larder of hope. This practice of preserving was an ancestral skill, but the war transformed it into a high-stakes operation. Every spare fruit or vegetable was a candidate for preservation. Across France, Germany, and the Soviet Union, women spent the late summer and autumn in a flurry of activity. Wild berries were boiled with beet syrup to create precious jams. Cucumbers and cabbages were submerged in brine to make pickles and sauerkraut, providing not just calories, but crucial vitamins. For families with access to a pig, preserving the meat was the most critical task. A single pig, raised and slaughtered in secret, could be the key to surviving winter. Every part was used. Meat was cured with salt to make hams and bacon. Fat was rendered into lard. The illicit slaughter of an animal was one of the most serious crimes a civilian could commit, as it was a major diversion of protein from the state. The evidence had to be hidden with extreme care. The cellar was the sanctuary for these preserved goods. Jars of jams and pickles lined the shelves, a visual promise of future meals. Hams and sausages hung from the rafters. These weren't just pantries, they were vaults. A raid that uncovered this hoard would be catastrophic, not just because of the legal punishment, which could range from fines to prison, but because it meant the erasure of their plan for survival. When a jar was finally opened in the dead of winter, it was a moment of profound significance. The taste of summer fruit in a spoonful of jam was more than just nutrition. It was a sensory link to a time of plenty, a reminder of a world not entirely defined by hunger. Hiding these jars and cured meats was the ultimate act of faith, a belief that the family would live to see the winter through. The potato in the cellar, the jam on the hidden shelf, the nettles from the hedgerow. These were not merely foodstuffs. In the crucible of World War II, they became symbols of a secret war fought not on the beaches of Normandy or the steppes of Russia, but in the kitchens and gardens of ordinary families. This was a war of ingenuity against oppression. The 8 foods we've explored were the weapons in this clandestine conflict. Hiding them was an act of profound defiance. It was a rejection of policies like the Nazi hunger plan, a strategy that saw the starvation of millions in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe as a tool of conquest and genocide. It was a refusal to accept that a family in Paris, a child in the Warsaw Ghetto, or a widow in Berlin should starve so that the war machine could be fed. The paradox we began with, of families hiding food while soldiers starved, is not a story of civilian selfishness. It's the story of a system that began to devour itself. A German soldier freezing on the Eastern Front was also a victim of the regime's logistical and moral collapse. The food confiscated in Ukraine or France was used to supply both the German home front and the Wehrmacht, creating a continent-wide crisis where corrupt officials often profited. The system was designed to preserve the powerful, not to care for the people. The true story of the home front is one of incredible courage. It's the story of the farmer who risked prison to slaughter a pig in secret, the mother who learned to make soup from weeds, and the child who smuggled bread past a guard. These were quiet, desperate, and deeply human acts of survival. They are a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to find a way to provide and to hold on to hope in the darkest of times. The great battles of World War II are marked by monuments, but these silent battles, fought over a handful of potatoes, are written into the soul of a generation, a hidden history of how, against all odds, they endured. If you found this look into the hidden side of World War II compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories that history books often forget. The resilience of the human spirit is found in the most unexpected places. Let us know in the comments which of these survival foods and the stories behind them surprised you the most. Thank you for watching.